What you are about to hear is not the story of knights, not the story of kings or banners, or the names that ended up carved into cathedral stone. This is the story of the men behind those men, the ones who came after the battle ended, who walked onto the field when everyone else had left, who touched what no one else would touch, and made what had happened there possible to forget. They did not fight, they cleared, and then the next war could begin. This is Hands of History. Tonight, the battlefield cleaner. There is a quality of light in Flanders that is different from other places. It comes in low and even, without shadow, without drama. The land is flat in a way that feels deliberate, as if it was always meant to be looked across, not into. Canals cut the fields into long rectangles. In summer, the air smells of wet wool and river mud. In autumn, it smells of rain before it arrives. This is the land where, for 2 centuries, armies came to settle what could not be settled elsewhere. The towns of Flanders were rich, not in the way that courts were rich, not in gold and ceremony, but in cloth, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres. The guilds controlled the production, the merchants controlled the trade, and the wealth that moved through these cities made them worth fighting over, repeatedly, by every power with ambitions in the north. The French crown wanted Flanders, the Flemish cities wanted independence, the English wanted the wool trade to continue without interruption. These interests did not resolve. They circled each other for generations, and every few decades the circling turned into a battle, and the battle turned into a field of dead. And after the field of dead, someone had to deal with what was there. Picture the field, not during the battle, after, the morning after, or the day after, when the armies have moved on or retreated into their respective positions, and the field itself is simply lying there. The sounds are different now, not the sounds of fighting, but the sounds of aftermath, wind across flat ground, crows, the occasional movement of something that is not quite still. This is where the work begins. The men who cleared the field were not volunteers. They were not moved by piety, exactly, or by mercy. They were moved by the terms of a contract, negotiated in advance with the city or the lord, who had reason to want the field cleared. The reason was practical. A field of unburied dead in summer is not a moral problem. It is a logistical one. Disease moved through armies the way weather moved through armies, invisibly and then all at once. A field left uncleaned for a week in July would begin to threaten the nearest town. The magistrates understood this. They had seen it before. And so before the armies even departed, before the last of the wounded had been moved, the contracts were already being written. Arrangements were made, sometimes formal, sometimes not. A sum agreed upon, a handshake, a line entered into the municipal ledger after the fact. Payment by the body, in some cases. Payment by the day, in others. And in most arrangements, some understanding about the materials found on the field. The crucial question, the one that made the work economically viable. The armor, the weapons, the horses that had not survived, the purses still attached to the belts of men who had no further use for them. What was found on the field belonged in whole or in part to the men doing the clearing, sometimes permitted by explicit agreement, sometimes simply accepted by everyone involved. Either way, it was understood. The men who took these arrangements were not from any particular guild. They existed at the edge of official categories, not soldiers, not merchants, not craftsmen in any recognized sense. They were known. The magistrates knew who to call. Some names appear more than once in the records, across decades, across different battles, on different fields, always in the same flat light. They had learned the work from the generation before them, and the generation before had learned it from the one before that. In a landscape where armies came back every 30 years, there was always someone who knew how to do this, and always someone willing to pay them to do it. The season in which a battle was fought changed everything, not the outcome. That was decided by other forces entirely, but what came after. What the field required, how long the city could afford to wait before sending someone in. In winter, the cold was a form of preservation. A field in January held its dead differently than a field in July. The decay was slower. The smell was different, sharper, cleaner, in a way that was almost misleading. The bodies could lie for several days without the emergency that summer created, and the clearers could take their time assessing what was there before beginning. The cold also hardened the ground, which made certain tasks easier and others harder. Digging was difficult. Moving across the field was easier. The mud that could swallow a boot in autumn became firm enough to walk on. In summer, none of this was true. A battle fought in July or August produced a field that could not wait. The heat worked quickly, and what the heat started, the insects continued, and within 2 days, the situation on the field was different in kind, not merely in degree, from what it had been on the morning after. The smell reached the city walls. The magistrates felt the urgency, not as an abstraction, but as a physical presence in the air above the town, and the contracts that were negotiated in summer were negotiated faster, with less argument over terms than the contracts of winter. The clearers understood this. Summer work was paid better, partly because it was more unpleasant, and partly because the city had less leverage. In winter, the magistrates could take a day to find the best price. In summer, they sent for whoever answered first. Autumn was the most common season for battles in Flanders. The harvest was in, the roads were still passable, and the campaigning season that had begun in spring was finding its resolution before the winter made movement impossible. Autumn in Flanders meant rain. It meant fields that were already saturated before anyone walked onto them. It meant mud of a particular Flemish character, deep, adhesive, cold, that caught at boots and wheels and the edges of everything being dragged. The clearers who worked autumn fields worked slowly. Every object recovered had to be pulled free before it could be assessed. Every step was deliberate. The field resisted, the way Flemish fields always resisted, and the work took longer than it should have, and the pay was calculated accordingly. The season was not incidental to the work. It was the work's first condition, before the contract, before the tools, before the sequence that the clearers had learned from their fathers. There was the weather. There was always the weather. The work began with sorting. Not sorting the living from the dead. That had already happened, or was happening separately, by others. The sorting that the clearers did was of a different kind. They moved through the field in a pattern, not randomly. Each man had a section. Each section was worked from one end to the other, systematically, the way you would harvest a field, because in a certain sense, that is what it was. You learned to read the field before you entered it. Which areas had seen the heaviest fighting, where the cavalry had charged and broken, where the infantry had held or failed to hold. This reading was not sentimental, it was economic. The areas of heaviest contact held the most material. The edges of the field, where men had fled or scattered, held less. A clearer who knew how to read a field could sequence his work efficiently, prioritizing the richest sections while the light was good and leaving the margins for later. Armor was the most valuable thing. A full suit of plate armor represented months of a craftsman's work and the price of several horses. Even damaged, even badly damaged, the metal was worth taking. The fixers and the smiths who worked behind the armies knew how to assess what was salvageable and what was not. The clearers knew this too, or they learned it quickly, because getting the assessment wrong in either direction cost money. The assessment required touch as much as sight. A dented breastplate might have a crack that was not visible from a distance, but that a hand running along the inside could feel. A sword blade might look intact and prove, when flexed slightly, to have been weakened at a point near the hilt. The clearers were not smiths, but they had spent enough time moving through the aftermath of violence to understand metal in the particular way that the work required. They knew the difference between damage that could be repaired and damage that had ended the object's useful life. They sorted accordingly. Swords, daggers, the fittings on bridles, the rings on fingers, if the fingers had rings. The clearers were not sentimental about this. The contract permitted it. The city wanted the field cleared, not curated. Horses were a separate category. A dead war horse was worth more than most men on that field had earned in a year. The hide, the bones, the fat, the hooves, the rendering trades knew what to do with a horse. There were buyers for every part. The clearers arranged the transactions, or they had arrangements already in place, with the tanners and the boilers and the glue makers, whose work depended on a steady supply of animal material. A living horse found on the field, wounded, wandering, too injured to move, was a different calculation. Sometimes it could be saved, and a saved war horse was worth considerably more than a dead one. The clearers made this judgment quickly, without sentiment. They had seen enough horses to know which injuries healed and which did not. The ones that could not be saved were dealt with, and the dealing with them was one of the quieter skills that the work required. The bodies were last, or rather, the bodies were processed in parallel with everything else, but the final disposition of them, the burial, came after the materials had been accounted for. This was not callousness. It was sequence. The materials spoiled faster. The bodies, in the cold months, could wait a day. The graves of a medieval battlefield were not individual. There was no time for individual graves, no reason for them, and often no way to implement them. The numbers made it impossible. What happened instead was the pit. Long, wide, deep enough to be effective. The bodies went in together in whatever order they arrived, and the earth went back over them. Clergy were sometimes present for this. A prayer was said, or was expected to have been said, and the record of a priest's presence at the burial was occasionally worth noting in the documents that the city kept. Not because the city cared deeply about the spiritual welfare of the men in the pit, though perhaps some individuals did, but because a documented burial was legally cleaner than an undocumented one. It established that something had been done, that the city had discharged its obligation. The obligation was to the living, not the dead. Who went into the pit without a name was determined by status and by which side had won. Knights and lords of the victorious side were identified if possible. Their families would be looking for them, would want the body returned, would pay for the return. This created a secondary economy alongside the primary one of salvaged equipment. The clearers knew which bodies carried heraldic markings, or they worked alongside those who did, the servants and retainers and representatives of the winning side, who could read a coat of arms on a surcoat or on a shield half buried in the mud. And they all understood that a correctly identified knight was worth considerably more than an anonymous infantryman. The identification required knowledge that was not written in any manual. It was held in the heads of men who had grown up in a world where heraldry was a functional language, where a pattern of colors and shapes told you not just who someone was, but who their father was, and which lord they owed allegiance to, and which families might come looking. A clearer who could read this language accurately could navigate the secondary market for identified dead with real precision. He knew which families had the resources to pay for a return, and which had the connections to make his life difficult if they discovered the identification had been wrong. Getting it wrong had costs. Getting it right had rewards. The clearers were careful. The men who could not be identified went into the pit, not because no one cared exactly, but because caring was not sufficient. In the absence of a coat of arms or a ring or some other marker that could be connected to a name and a family and a payment. The anonymous dead of a medieval battlefield were anonymous for the same reason they had been alive in that field in the first place. They did not have rank. Rank was what gave you a name. Without rank, the pit. The pit closed. The field went back to being a field. The armor that left the field did not disappear. it went to the smiths, and the smiths repaired what could be repaired, and what was repaired went back into the supply that armies drew from when they needed equipment. The cycle was not a scandal. It was the economy of war in a world where metal was expensive and armies were persistent. Some of it went directly to sale. A sword with good steel was a sword with good steel, regardless of who had last held it. The clearers understood this. The buyers understood this too. The transaction did not require anyone to think too carefully about the chain of events that had produced the item in question. Money changed hands in the market towns. The sword went home with someone who needed a sword. The men who had done the clearing understood, if they thought about it, that they were not simply tidying up after war. They were servicing it, returning the materials to circulation, making it possible for the same fields in 30 years to host the same work again. The armor on the next man who died in Flanders might be the armor that had been salvaged from the man who died before him. The cycle was long enough that no one would notice, but the clearers, if they kept records, and some of them did, might have noticed across a lifetime. There is a paradox in this work that does not resolve easily. The man clearing the field is protecting the town. He is preventing the plague that would come from leaving things as they are. In this sense, he is a public servant, performing a function that the city cannot perform itself, that no one else will perform. He is also making the next war logistically possible. Both of these things are true. They live in the same set of hands. In the summer of 1302, a French army came south into Flanders to reassert the crown's authority over cities that had grown too independent. The army was cavalry-heavy, professional, and confident. The Flemish force that met them outside the city of Courtrai was made up largely of militia, weavers and fullers, and guild workers who had trained with weapons, but who were not, by any reasonable assessment, expected to win. They won. The French cavalry, attacking across ground that concealed drainage ditches, broke apart before it reached the Flemish lines. The horses went down, the knights went with them, and the Flemish militia, fighting on foot with the particular ferocity of people defending something they had built themselves, did not give much ground on that day. When it was over, the field held an extraordinary quantity of French dead and an extraordinary quantity of French gold. The Golden Spurs. Knights wore them as a mark of rank, and there were hundreds of knights dead on the field at Courtrai. The Flemish collected the spurs and hung them in the church of Our Lady in Courtrai as a trophy, a visible proof of what had happened there. The battle took its name from this collection, the Battle of the Golden Spurs. But the spurs were the public story. The private story was the clearing that came after. The field outside Courtrai was cleared by people who had contracts, or who established contracts quickly in the days that followed. The armor that came off that field was some of the finest made in France. The horses were war horses, bred for cavalry, worth significant money in the markets that dealt in such things. The city had reason to want the field cleared. The summer was warm, the city was downwind, and the smell of an uncleared battlefield reaches further than most people who have not experienced it would expect. The clearers came. They worked through the field in their systematic way. The Golden Spurs were already gone, collected by the militia in the hours immediately after the battle. What remained was everything else. They worked for days. The French knights on that field were among the highest-ranking men in the kingdom, dukes, counts, lords with heraldic markings that even a Flemish clearer, working in the summer heat, could identify. Families would come looking. Letters had already been sent. The identification work at Courtrai was more careful and more lucrative than at most fields. The pit that received the men who could not be identified, the ordinary cavalry, the servants, the men without coats of arms, was wide and deep and is still there somewhere under fields that are now farmland. The city paid what it had agreed to pay. The materials moved into the channels of commerce that materials moved through. The field went back to being a field. 30 years later, another French army came into Flanders. Some of the equipment they carried had passed through other hands in the interval. No one was counting. The men who did this work left almost nothing with their names on it. The city records preserved their contracts. Sometimes a payment here, an authorization there, a line in the accounts of the municipal treasurer acknowledging that a sum had been disbursed for the clearing of the fields south of the city walls, following the engagement of such and such a date. The name of the contractor, occasionally, the terms, in the careful language of municipal administration. Not much else. There are no memoirs of battlefield clearers, no manuals, no professional literature, no records of a guild or a confraternity that organized the work and passed down its practices. What they knew, they carried. When they died, the knowledge went with them, or it went to whoever had watched them work, had learned the sequence, had understood what the contract required and what the market would bear. The anonymity was not incidental. It was structural. The work required a willingness to touch what others would not touch, to be seen doing what others preferred not to witness. The social cost of that visibility was managed, partly, by not having too much visibility. You knew who to call. You did not necessarily talk about it at market. In the town, he was known without being acknowledged. The baker knew who he was. The blacksmith knew. The magistrate who signed the contract knew, and nodded when they passed in the street, and did not linger. There was no ostracism exactly. The work was legitimate, the contract was official, the payment came from the public purse. But there was a distance, a slight adjustment in how conversations began and ended when he was nearby, a preference in the tavern for the table in the corner rather than the long bench where men sat close together. He had touched things. Everyone knew what things. The knowledge sat between him and the rest of the town like a pane of very clean glass, present, transparent, impossible to ignore once you knew it was there. He lived with this, the way a man lives with any condition that is permanent and unchosen. He did not complain about it, because complaining would have required discussing it, and discussing it was not something the town encouraged. He simply existed alongside the distance, year after year, contract after contract, and the distance existed alongside him. And yet the fields of Flanders were cleared, again and again, after battle, across 2 centuries of recurring war. The fields were cleared, and the towns stayed healthy, and the equipment moved back into circulation, and the armies that came to fight the next war were equipped, in part, with the salvage of the last one. Someone did that. Someone walked out onto the field when everyone else had left. Someone touched what no one else would touch, and worked the sequence that the contract required, and took what the contract permitted, and buried what needed burying, and walked back to the city before dark. Every time, without a name that history kept. The field outside Courtrai has been farmland for 700 years. The pit is under it somewhere, unmarked. The armor that was salvaged has long since rusted out of existence. The swords are gone. The horses are gone. The gold spurs are still in the church, or rather, copies of them. The originals were taken back by the French in a later war. The church kept the copies. The field kept nothing. That was hands of history. Next time, we go back inside another room, another profession, another person history forgot to name. If this is where you want to return, subscribe. We will be here. Until next time, sleep well.